There's a lot of confusing information, and especially in today's world on the internet, if you type in the words diabetes nutrition, type 1 diabetes nutrition, what to eat living with diabetes, or any version of that, you get bombarded with, tons of people saying, listen to me, listen to me, listen to me. I have your answer. I can solve your problem. And a good majority of that information is slanted towards a low carbohydrate diet and or a ketogenic diet. And having gone through a 5.5 year long PhD, having gone through a personal transition, I knew intuitively that is not the answer.
That was Dr. Cyrus Khambatta, and today he joins me with the mindful diabetic, Robby Barbaro, on episode 3 of the Bravest Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to episode number 3 of the Bravest Podcast. I'm Craig, and on today's show we have Dr. Cyrus Khambatta and Robby Barbaro. Now these guys are two significant forces in the world of diabetes nutrition. Now, you might be familiar with Cyrus through his work under the Mango Man Nutrition moniker, and Robby, aka Mindful Diabetic Robby, is known for his super popular Instagram account and his YouTube channel talking about his experiences living a fruit-based diet. Now, together they've created Mastering Diabetes, which is a philosophy and a program designed to help anyone with diabetes reduce insulin resistance and improve their blood glucose levels through a whole foods, plant-based diet. We start off our conversation covering both of their diagnosis stories, as well as Cyrus's diagnosis with not just one, but 3 autoimmune conditions within a 6-month time frame. Cyrus shares the emotional roller coaster he was on during that time, and how he made the decision to transition to a plant-based diet. Robby also discusses his diagnosis as a preteen and his move toward a 100% fruit-based diet. Now, when we think about how we're encouraged to eat when we have diabetes, the most common suggestions center around a high-protein, low-carbohydrate diet. And based on what Cyrus and Robby tell us in this interview, that particular way of eating might in fact work against us if we're trying to either reverse type 2 or better manage type 1. And the core reason they say is insulin resistance from fat that builds in our bodies over time. Their answer equates to a higher carbohydrate, low-fat, plant-based diet, and throughout this interview, Cyrus and Robby address misconceptions associated with their approach. Now, what's important about Cyrus and Robby's philosophy is that they not only present anecdotal evidence from their own experimenting, they also focus heavily on the scientific literature to formulate the recommendations they're putting out into the world. While they admit their approach to diabetes management through a plant-based diet might run counter to popular thinking, they point to the quantitative outcomes they personally achieve, as well as what their clients experience, including reduced blood glucose levels and reduced injected insulin needs. Hold tight because we take this conversation through a solid amount of science. Cyrus is a PhD from UC Berkeley, but both Cyrus and Robby keep the information completely understandable throughout. Even if you're not ready to jump on the whole foods, plant-based diet train at this point, I'm sure this conversation will open your mind a little more to consider the research and the science behind it all. I could have talked to these guys forever, and I'm super excited to share this episode with all of you. So sit back and enjoy my conversation with Dr. Cyrus Khambatta and the mindful diabetic, Robby Barbaro. So you guys ready?
Yep.
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. So I just want to thank you guys very much for being here. You guys are true influencers in the world of diabetes and health and nutrition. And it's really so awesome for me to have you guys on the podcast. I've been following you for a while, and it's just amazing to have a conversation with you. So I'm excited to have you for a number of reasons today, but what I'd like to do is dig in, learn about your stories in terms of your diagnosis stories, because everybody has one, but everyone's is interesting and unique. And then I would really like to draw a line from that to how it translated into Mastering Diabetes, which is the wellness venture you guys have been collaborating on. So thank you, Cyrus, and thank you, Robby, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with me today.
Absolutely, we're really excited to be here, and we'd love to share our message as much as and have it go as far and wide as possible. So thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, it's really great to be talking to you in your professional radio voice.
Thanks, Robby. I appreciate it. So both of you guys are a wealth of knowledge, and I'm really looking to learn from you guys. You have super interesting backgrounds, and there's a lot of great information that I'm hoping that we'll be able to share with our listeners today. But I'm guessing we'll probably need to schedule a round 2 of the podcast because I doubt that we'll get to it all today, but we'll do the best that we can. So here we go. Here's my first question for you guys. Everyone, as I said, has their diagnosis story, and maybe what I'm hoping you guys can do is really share your stories. But what I'm really curious about is not just the story itself, but specifically what your mindset might have been at the time you were diagnosed, and then ultimately if that mindset has changed over the course of time to where we are now. So Robby, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, so I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 12, just about to turn 13. And my older brother actually had type 1 diabetes at the time. So I was complaining to my mom, like, I'm thirsty, I'm going to the bathroom all the time, I think I might have type 1 diabetes. She's like, no, you don't be silly. And so she was out of town, it was just me and my brother at home, and she called in to check on me, and I said, Mom, I couldn't sleep last night, I was cramping. She's like, okay, go upstairs, use your brother's blood sugar meter and see what's going on. I tested myself, and it was like somewhere around 400. And my brother's like, yep, you have type 1 diabetes. Let's go to the doctor. So we go to the general doctor, do the regular tests. And then once the doctor came back and confirmed it, I remember my brother being in the room, like crying, just being like, oh, I'm so sorry you have to deal with this. And then it didn't really hit me at the time. And I just sort of was like, okay, I guess this is happening. So I went to the hospital, got checked in there. My parents flew home that night, and I only had to stay there one night because my family already knew what to do. And I just always remember my parents saying, it's just an inconvenience. So, don't worry about it. You can still do whatever you want. It's just an inconvenience. So that was kind of like the mentality starting out.
So it's awesome that you had that amazing support at the very beginning. Unfortunately, because there was previous experience with your older brother, but it's great that they had the ability to kind of get you going, pick you up, and it didn't seem as though there was too much time kind of being down on yourself with this new diagnosis.
Yeah. No, it was great. I had all the support I needed.
Yeah, which is so important, especially early on with all the confusion and the questions that we have. Now, Cyrus, you were a little older when you were diagnosed, correct? What was your story?
Yeah, that's right. I was diagnosed at the age of 22. So I was a senior in college, and I was going through finals. And I noticed that I was extremely thirsty. I was urinating about 17, 18, 20 times a day, and I just had no energy. So I knew that something was wrong. I just had no idea what it was. So I picked up the phone. I called my sister, who's a family practice doctor of osteopathy, and I explained all my symptoms to her, and she immediately started crying. And she said, please drop what you're doing right now. Go to the health center because you're experiencing the symptoms of type 1 diabetes. And at the time, I was thinking to myself, type 1? Type 1 diabetes doesn't make any sense. The only thing I knew about diabetes was that it had something to do with old people and cake. And as a result, I was thinking, I'm not an old person. I don't eat cake. This doesn't make any sense. So I went to the health center. I checked myself in, and within 15 minutes or so, they had checked my blood glucose, and it was a 650. So I was supposed to be between 80 and 130, and I was 6 times as higher than I needed to be. So the nurse looks at me and she says, we are going to take you to the hospital right now. So I said, listen, I'll do whatever I need to do, but I feel terrible, so please help me out. So they take me to the hospital. Within, another hour or so, I have saline going into one arm, and I have a drip irrigation of insulin going into the other arm. And they're now explaining to me that I have type 1 diabetes. So I was actually really scared at this point in time for a couple of reasons. Type 1 diabetes was the third autoimmune condition in the course of 6 months. The first one was Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, or Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or hypothyroidism. The second one was alopecia universalis, which is why I have no hair. So it's basically complete hair loss. I have no hair, I have no eyebrows, I have no eyelashes, I have no nose hair, I have nothing. And then the third was type 1 diabetes. And like I said, all three of these came within a 6-month period. And so what this indicated to me that there was a global dysfunction. And I was very nervous that my health was going to continue to spin out of control, and that, you know, after having three diagnoses, maybe I would develop a fourth and a fifth and a sixth and a 10th. And at that point, I felt like I needed to really make some positive change. I just had no idea what I was supposed to do.
Wow. So you were really hit with a couple of punches all within a very short period of time. I can't even imagine the amount of stress that you're experiencing at that time. And how could you even possibly find all the support that you need for all those varied yet what might seem to be related disorders that you're experiencing? So it's probably a point where you're questioning a lot of things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was started to question my lifestyle. You know, am I eating the right foods? Am I exercising the right amount? Am I too stressed? Am I drinking too much alcohol? You know, there were many things up in the air, and I just didn't know where to start. So I just listened to the advice of the doctors and nurses at the time, which they said go onto a low carbohydrate diet. You know, so I started my carbohydrate restriction diet at that point. And even though I was supposed to feel a lot better and my glucose was supposed to become more controllable, the exact opposite happened. I felt even worse after doing this for 3 months, 6 months, a year. And my energy levels were getting lower. I was getting more anxiety. My breath started to smell funny. I could not exercise. I literally could not exercise. I felt like I had full body rigor mortis. And, you know, when it started to get in the way of my ability to use my body, that's when I said, no game or no deal. Something has to change, and something has to change right now. And that's when I started to make the change towards a plant-based diet.
Sounds great. I definitely want to dive into that in a little bit as well. It's interesting because, Cyrus, your background, your undergraduate background, I think was in engineering, correct? And then you ended up going on for a PhD in nutritional biochem, which is a very interesting switch. And you were at, I think, UC Berkeley. And then you launched what was a coaching and nutritional educational website called Mango Man Nutrition. It is pretty much stemmed from your love for mangoes at the time, from what I understand.
That's exactly right.
and Robby, you earned your degree from the University of Florida. That's actually where my doctorate is from. So, and your work as mindful diabetic Robby is very well known across the internet. And as we're looking on camera right now, your metal shells with all the fruit in the background is a very familiar set that I've watched a number of different times before. But you also spent a lot of time with the nonprofit organization Forks Over Knives. So you guys have very kind of varied yet intertwined backgrounds. But what I'm really interested to understand is how you guys connected in the first place.
Yeah, I'll just put one correction in there. Forks Over Knives isn't necessarily a nonprofit. But I had a lot of fun at Forks Over Knives. It was a really, really good run. So Cyrus actually was a inspiration for me. So we learned about this diet from the same guru, and in that book, Cyrus was an example. He was a testimonial in the book. And I remember reading his story there was like a blog on the internet about him, and he was involved with an organization about, you know, plant-based athletes in the Bay Area. And it was just super inspiring. I was like showing my parents, hey, look, this guy can do it. I'm going to do it too. And so we knew of each other, but we hadn't really connected. And then we eventually did a presentation together in the Bay Area. Just sort of just a one-off event where people could come and try the food and learn why this works. And we were both speaking. And at that time, we were both coaching and helping people, and just sort of like, hey, you know what? Like, let's figure out how we can work together. And eventually, here we are today with Mastering Diabetes.
A couple of superpowers coming together there. So that's awesome. Yeah, Cyrus, both of you follow different varieties of kind of a plant-based diet. And Cyrus, you talked a little bit about what prompted you to switch over into plant-based diet because of all of the different autoimmune conditions that you were experiencing in a short period of time. Robby, where did your decision come in to jump into not vegan lifestyle per se? This is fruit-based, correct? So maybe you can help me understand how that came about.
Yeah, so I slowly started making lifestyle change because my dad was selling supplements. It was with a network marketing company, and it was so, and then it was like, oh, hey, the story is your soil doesn't have enough nutrients, so we need to have supplements. Like, okay, whatever. So, and then every step of the way, it was some logical thing like, oh, it's better to have grass-fed beef than beef from a factory, and maybe it's better to have raw milk instead of pasteurized milk. And it was just always a progression. And eventually, I came across a book that just planted a seed in my mind that maybe it's possible to reverse type 1 diabetes. So I read that. That just like sent me on a tirade. Like, you know what? Like, I'm going to do this. Like, somebody's got to do it. It's like kind of like the 4-minute mile concept. You know, scientists, the smartest people in the world said you cannot run a 4-minute mile. Your heart's going to explode. So I'm like, okay, the smartest people in the world right now say we cannot heal type 1 diabetes. Well, somebody's going to have to do this. So I went on this tirade. Like, what can I possibly do to be the healthiest human being I can and give my body a chance to heal itself? So that's the original mindset. And eventually I came across this fruit-based diet, which one of the main reasons I got into doing it initially, there's more reasons now, but initially is that digestion takes the most energy in our body. So if we can lessen the amount of energy and resources used for digestion, then the body can divert that energy towards healing and fixing itself in ways that are beyond our comprehension. And so that was the mindset. And I just, you know, from the beginning, I had a reason, like a motivator, like I'm going to do this. I believe in this. And that is sort of now it's, 10 years later. And because it had such a strong purpose, it was easy to adopt, what's a very challenging thing to do in our modern day environment. So that was really the basis of it. I obviously have not reversed type 1 diabetes, although I still think it's possible. I don't think we know exactly how it's going to happen, but I believe in some way, shape, or form, there's going to be a solution to this. And that was my motivation.
Now, taking that concept a little further, and when you guys got together to develop Mastering Diabetes, what was the catalyst? And clearly, it's your own personal experiences with diet, exercise, your own battles or the day-to-day kind of obstacles that you might face with type 1 diabetes. What was the real catalyst for launching Mastering Diabetes and kind of the reason for putting it out into the world? And Cyrus, maybe you can answer that question for us.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. As you know, living with type 1 diabetes, there's a lot of confusing information. And especially in today's world on the internet, if you type in the words diabetes nutrition, type 1 diabetes nutrition, what to eat living with diabetes, or any version of that, you get bombarded with, tons of people saying, listen to me, listen to me, listen to me. I have your answer. I can solve your problem. And a good majority of that information is slanted towards a low carbohydrate diet and or a ketogenic diet. And having gone through a 5.5-year long PhD, having gone through a personal transition, I knew intuitively that is not the answer. And Robby knows that that is not the answer. So, we've invested so much of our personal lives and so much of our time into understanding the true power of a plant-based diet and addressing the root cause of all blood glucose variability in type 1 diabetes, prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, gestational diabetes, you name it, which is insulin resistance. So we thought to ourselves, you know what? Right now, the whole world, the status quo is eat a low carbohydrate diet or eat a ketogenic diet. But that's not the right answer. And so as a result of that, we decided we're going to get involved in this world because there are so many people around the world who have tried low carbohydrate diets or are currently trying low carbohydrate diets, and they feel they have poor health and they feel very low energy and their glucose is all over the place. So we know that there's a huge growing demand for lifestyle change, and we thought, hey, if we get involved in this process and try and become inspirational coaches for people and teach them a method which doesn't seem to be very popular right now, maybe we can start to promote some really positive change and see if we can start to change people's lives one by one by one.
That's awesome. So here's the question, though. As you said, it is completely against what most people would say is appropriate for someone with diabetes. I can remember I was told high protein, low carb. make sure you monitor your carb intake. That's the one thing we're carb counting all the time. That's kind of the key number that we look at. And that's what I was, for the past, God knows how many years, that's what I've been focused on. So why does a higher carb, low protein type of a diet work? Animal protein, I want to be very specific about that too, because just because you're saying plant-based, it doesn't mean no protein, just the opposite. And I want to talk about the protein question in a second too, but why does it work?
Okay, so here's a way to think about it. All diets, you as a human being derive your energy from three macronutrients: carbohydrate, fat, and protein. All the other components of your diet, vitamins, minerals, fiber, water, antioxidants, those are all, supporting cast members, but they don't actually provide your body with energy. So what the diabetes world tells you is that you got to minimize your carbohydrate intake and eat more fat and more protein, because that's ultimately what's going to lead you towards better blood glucose control. And so what they're doing is they're vilifying carbohydrates, and they're saying, if you eat carbohydrates, then you run the risk of having a higher blood glucose, and then that in turn is going to give you a higher A1C value, et cetera, et cetera. That's going to make your life more difficult. Now, what we advocate, what we've researched, and what we support is the idea that fat and protein are not, there are negative consequences associated with eating a diet that is high in fat and high in protein. And the major negative consequence that we have to address is insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is always associated with type 2 diabetes, and pretty much only associated with type 2 diabetes because it is the cause of type 2 diabetes. In other words, you cannot develop type 2 diabetes if you haven't already developed insulin resistance. This has been known in the medical literature for close to 100 years. So if you go to your endocrinologist or your doctor or any certified diabetes educator, and you say the word insulin resistance, the first association they make is type 2 diabetes and prediabetes. That's it. Nobody believes, or very few people believe, that insulin resistance actually pertains to people living with type 1 diabetes as well. Now, if we take a step back and ask, well, what is insulin resistance? Insulin resistance is caused by the storage of fat in tissues that are not designed to store fat. So I'll say that one more time. It's the storage of fat in tissues that are not designed to store fat. So your fat tissue is designed to store fat and liberate fat as needed, depending on your nutritional status. And so you can think of your fat tissue as actually being a safe place for fat to accumulate. And so in theory, if you were to eat a lot of fat in your diet and 100% of that fat was to get directed to your fat tissue, then there would be no problem. But the problem is that biological organisms are not 100% efficient. And so as a result of that, when you eat fat in your diet, some of that fat gets partitioned into your fat tissue, and that's okay. But then some of that fat actually gets stored inside of your liver. Some of that fat ends up inside of your muscle tissues. So what we're talking about is intra-organ fat and intramuscular fat. And when the amount of fat inside of your muscles and your liver in particular gets larger as a result of time, after having eaten a high-fat diet for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, 6 months, a year, then you end up developing insulin resistance because these tissues have absorbed a sufficient quantity of fat. And what they do is they basically say, listen, I'm full. I do not want any more energy. I don't want any more fat. And I especially don't want any more glucose, because I have so much already stored inside of me that I'm going to do whatever I can to block any more from coming in. So what they do is they effectively construct a wall. And the wall that they construct makes it so that when insulin comes by to say, knock, knock, I have some glucose available for you, the muscle and the liver say, no, I don't want that stuff. Are you kidding me? Look what I have inside. I have to burn this giant collection of fat that's accumulated over the course of months and years. Let me do that first before I take on any glucose. And so as a result of that, it basically initiates what's called insulin resistance. So insulin resistance, you can think of it as just being insulin rejection. I'm going to stop paying attention to insulin. And by stopping to pay attention to insulin, I can keep glucose outside of coming inside these tissues. So then that results in glucose getting trapped inside of your blood, so that when you go and check your blood glucose, now you see a really high number, and you're saying, well, that doesn't make any sense. I had one banana. I have one banana, and now my blood glucose is a 300. That doesn't make any sense. So the way that this whole process can be actually reversed is by going directly to the root cause, which is what started insulin resistance in the first place. So if dietary fat is actually what set the stage for insulin resistance, then minimizing your fat intake can start to clear or oxidize those accumulated fat molecules inside of your muscle and your liver.
So
and that process...
let's talk about that for a second, because insulin resistance is clearly a core component of mastering diabetes. And you're touching upon a couple of other principles that are kind of like the core principles of the program. Maybe you can kind of highlight just one or two more of those principles for me.
For sure. So insulin resistance is the number one core principle. Insulin resistance is pervasive amongst all people with diabetes. I don't care what flavor of diabetes you have. If you've been eating a low carbohydrate diet, you have eaten yourself into a state of insulin resistance. As a result of doing that, the next thing that happens is that not only does your blood glucose get high when you eat carbohydrate-rich foods, but your medication requirements also increase. And that's a really important thing. So over the course of time, what people experience, whether you're living with type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes, is that their need for oral medication goes up and their need for insulin goes up. So we have either oral or injectable medications, your requirements for which are going up over time. And then in a lot of people, they end up gaining weight. And so, what our program focuses on is we teach you how to adopt a low-fat plant-based diet so that you can drop your medication requirements, you can lose weight, you can gain a tremendous amount of energy, you can start to become a more active individual, which is beneficial for another 1,000 reasons, and your blood glucose becomes incredibly manageable. So it's almost like by addressing it via a lower fat approach, you can address 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different aspects of diabetes health at the same time.
Yeah, so
I just want to address a nuanced point here, because I know you probably have a lot of type 1s listening to this. If they're really into diet, they've heard of Richard Bernstein, they've heard of the keto approach. It's very popular right now. So something Cyrus and I talk about a lot is not confusing a decreased need for total insulin for insulin sensitivity. Those are two totally different things. So if you choose to follow a diet where you're basically eating pretty much no carbs, less than 30 grams of carbs a day, yes, you can, at that point, you could decrease your total insulin need and probably get quite low, but it doesn't mean you've become more insulin sensitive. Insulin's primary function is to take glucose out of the bloodstream and put it in the cells. So if you stop eating carbohydrates, just because your insulin went down did not mean you became more insulin sensitive. One of the great analogies we heard is from Michael Clapper. He was a participant in our Mastering Diabetes Summit, where he says, if you're a bad driver and somebody gets in accidents a lot and you take away their license, they now have a perfect driving record. Their driving record is great. Have you solved the problem? Like, are they actually a better driver now? No, you just took away their license. So it's the same thing that's going on in the keto approach, in the low-carb approach, which is fine. Like, look, we respect those people. We've got nothing against them. All we're saying is just know that that's not an increase in insulin sensitivity. And we talk about this over and over again on our website and everything about measuring your 24-hour insulin sensitivity. You take the total amount of carbs you eat, divide that by the total insulin you use in a 24-hour period, and you can measure your 24-hour insulin sensitivity. So somebody like Bernstein's eating 30 grams of carbs, he might take 10 total units of insulin. That's a 3-to-1 ratio over a 24-hour period. Someone like Cyrus and I, we're somewhere in the 700 range of carbs. Cyrus' insulin intake is somewhere around 25, 26, lower than 30 units a day. I'm more around 40 units a day. Either way you slice that, you're now talking about a sub, a 20-to-1 type of ratio. So you compare the insulin sensitivity, it's a different ballgame.
Sure. And these numbers are super important. And let's boil it down to be a little bit more simplistic now for somebody who is kind of at the beginning stages here, right? And they totally buy into this concept of, okay, high fat, low fat, high carb, low carb. We understand what you guys are talking about in terms of it's not a good idea to reduce our carb intake. What are the biggest barriers that you're seeing with that type of person in terms of kind of, okay, intellectualizing what you're saying and then ultimately taking the appropriate first step to actually doing something about it? Because it's one thing to think about it, right? And then it's a completely different thing to actually act on it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the main the main thing that prevents most people from attempting a plant-based diet, especially a low-fat plant-based diet, is they are afraid. There's a fear inside of them that if they were to attempt this approach and they were to start eating foods like bananas and potatoes and quinoa and brown rice, that their glucose would skyrocket up into the 300s and 400s. But what actually happens is that people who, if you take a two-step approach, right? Step one is first reduce fat intake significantly. And then step two is to increase carbohydrate intake significantly, right? That process can take a full week, right? If you follow this type of approach, then you maximize your chances of of success and minimize your risk for having these really high rogue blood glucoses. Well, I think what a lot of people do is they say, okay, great, I'm going to try this approach. And then they immediately just start pouring in a bunch of fruits and potatoes and brown rice. And then they say, look, my blood glucose meter says it's a 450. This approach doesn't work, right? So what I would say is that, in order to maximize your chances of success, you kind of have to, we teach people how to walk before they run and to follow a very specific set of steps that enables you to drop your fat intake and then increase your carbohydrate intake, again, from whole sources, not from refined breads and cereals and pastas, but from things that grow on trees and things that grow in the ground. And once that process unfolds, then it's you maximize your chances of success.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit, and we touched upon this concept of protein before. And when most people take a look as an outsider, looking at whether it's a vegan, a vegetarian, a fruitarian diet, is that correct, right? A fruit-based diet.
Yeah.
The one thing that always comes to mind is we think of someone who's skinny, who's sickly, who's malnourished. Where are you getting your protein from, right? Aside from that kind of obvious question, which definitely, Robby, I'd like you to address that for me. What other types of limitations have you guys found with the types of nutrition and diet that you propose versus kind of mainstream diets at this point?
Got it. Okay, that's a good question. I think the first thing is majority of our clients don't eat the same way that you see me eating on Instagram and YouTube videos. So we apologize if that's confusing. Most people in our program are eating more of a forks over knives type style diet, or a Dr. John McDougall. It includes a lot of starch. So we include things like beans and rice and potatoes, and squashes. And so most people are eating a cooked food meal at lunch and dinner. They're starting their day with fruit. That's the gist of our program in general. Everybody tweaks it a little bit here or there. But in general, this diet, this fear of missing out on various nutrients is really just, it's just unfounded, really. I mean, we are a nation that struggles with like eating too much, not missing out on things. So, of course, they have supplement with B12 on our program. But other than that, there's really very little things to worry about. Unless somebody has some type of symptom, then we take that into an individual account, and maybe there might be a necessary supplement here or there. But in general, it's not an issue.
Yes.
And one thing I'd like to add to this whole thing is that, like you touched on, the main roadblock for a lot of individuals, besides the fact that they have maybe a fear of eating carbohydrates, is they feel is if they're going to adopt a plant-based diet that they're going to become protein deficient. You've heard it, I've heard it, Robby's heard it, and it's a myth that is very pervasive in the world of nutrition as a whole, even if you're not in the diabetes world. And so we've sort of conditioned ourselves to believe that if you're not eating meat and or dairy products and or cheese and or fish, that somehow you're not going to take in a sufficient amount of protein, and then that's going to lead to things like hair loss and wrinkly skin, and you're going to have a decreased muscle mass, and you might develop osteoporosis at the same time. And so what the scientific evidence actually shows is that it's very challenging, incredibly difficult to get to this point where you're actually in a true protein deficiency. So even if you were to eat nothing but fruits and nothing but vegetables just as a matter of argument here, the amount of protein that you are consuming is about 6 to 10% of your total calorie intake in protein. And even at that level, which is a smaller number than you would experience on, the standard American diet, that level of protein intake is still sufficient to provide a large amount of fresh amino acids, and especially what are called essential amino acids that your body cannot manufacture. And you absolutely, number one, you do not develop protein deficiencies. Number two, you actually have an adequate amount of protein to promote muscle regeneration, hormone synthesis, brain function, skin function, kidney function, eye function, etc. So a second thing too is that the type of protein that comes in on a plant-based diet, it obviously comes from the plant world. Animal-based protein and plant-based protein are two completely different species. They shouldn't even be called the same thing for the sake of argument here. There's plenty of literature to show that animal-based proteins can actually increase cell replication rates, and they can potentially lead to tumor formation and thus set the stage for cancer. And there's also another whole line of evidence that shows that animal-based proteins contain significant amount of sulfurinated amino acids, which themselves decrease the pH of your blood and then set the stage for calcium leakage out of your bones. So there's a number of what's the word I'm looking for? There's a number of detrimental effects that are associated with eating animal proteins, and plant-based proteins do not come along with those effects. In fact, they come along with a whole host of antioxidants and fiber and vitamins and minerals at the same time. So the overall nutrient density that you receive from eating these plant-based foods actually leads you towards less inflammation and improved overall metabolic health.
You know what I love about what you guys are putting out there is, and Cyrus, I'm sure this is just a part of your mentality as a PhD, is you guys really look to the scientific literature to make statements versus just kind of hearsay. And Robby, I know that I've seen videos with you in the past also where you're breaking down peer-reviewed research studies, really trying to help people understand exactly what it means. And I'm guessing that you guys might have touched upon a recent article. It was actually just published in this month's Journal of Geriatric Cardiology, and this has not so much to do with not only to do with geriatric population, but it happened to be published in that journal. It was from Dr. Michelle McMacken, and I think you guys know her very well, physician here at NYU in New York City, who is a strong advocate for a plant-based diet. And based on how I read the article, I have a little bit of research in my background as well. It seems as though her article supports, to a great extent, a lot of what you guys have been talking about today, correct?
Absolutely. We're friends with Michelle McMacken, and we actually interviewed her for our online summit, and we interact with her at conferences all the time. This article that she wrote, it's actually, let's put it this way. She is a huge advocate for the power of a plant-based diet. Whether you're talking about diabetes, whether you're talking about cardiovascular disease, it doesn't really matter. As far as metabolic health is concerned, she knows very well from a research perspective and from a clinical perspective just how powerful that plant-based diets truly can be. And again, she comes at it from a research angle as opposed to a more sensational angle as well.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's amazing to see all the research that's kind of bubbling up surrounding plant-based diet and how it's definitely helpful, not only for those with diabetes, as you said, but for people who across the spectrum, whether it's cardiovascular disease or any sort of health-related issue, or equally as important, prevention of health issues as well. So I know I have limited time with you guys, and I want to make sure I'm totally respectful of that. But the one thing that I really want to make sure that I touch upon is you guys are hosting an upcoming retreat in July, Southern California. And your retreats for Mastering Diabetes take attendees from education and inspiration to, as we were talking about, sustainable action in their lives. It's primarily for folks who have type 1 or type 2 diabetes, but I'm guessing you also might have family members there or people who are trying to understand it, how to help their loved ones as well. And I think that the action part is something I'd really like to zero in on. And what you guys do is do more than just talk about change. You actually foster real-time action and tracking, as we kind of touched upon a little bit before, during the retreat to prove that the positive change is not only possible, but it's probable, right? Talk to me a little bit about what happens during these retreats. Robby
Okay.
or Cyrus, either one.
All right, sure. I'll take this one. So our retreats are actually really fun. It's one of the favorite parts of our job. The way that it works is that people fly in from all around the world, and we host it in Southern California. And people come in on a Thursday night, and then we're with them all day Friday, all day Saturday, all day Sunday, and then people leave on Monday morning. And during the retreat, we educate people with 3 interactive lectures per day about the power of a low-fat, plant-based, whole foods diet. We talk about insulin resistance. We talk about medication usage. We talk about exercise. We talk about intermittent fasting. Then, just like you were saying, we use this as an experimental test ground where it's not just theoretical, like this is what could happen to you. This is going to happen to you. The reason you're coming to this retreat is so that we can actually start to implement these methods on you starting now. And then you will not only understand from an intellectual perspective how this is affecting your body, but you will be able to see changes in your blood glucose immediately. And so, when Robby and I both transitioned to eating a low-fat, plant-based whole foods diet, both of us recognized that our blood glucose fell pretty rapidly. And as a result of that, our insulin requirements fell pretty rapidly. And it fell a lot more rapidly than I thought it was going to happen. So, while we're at these retreats, one of the things that we educate people about is that you can gain a tremendous amount of insulin sensitivity in a short period of time. So like I said earlier, you have months and years of accumulated fatty acid deposits inside of your muscle and inside of your liver. But you can start to see positive change and reduced medication requirements and improved blood glucose within 24 hours. And then it gets better by the 48th hour and the 72nd hour. And then, by the time 4.5 days are up, people have, I kid you not, cut their insulin use in the case of type 1 diabetes by 50%. But the beauty here, like Robby was touching on earlier, is that not only have they cut their insulin use by 50%, they've actually quadrupled their carbohydrate intake, right? So it doesn't make any sense because you're saying, okay, person with type 1 diabetes eats 4 times as many carbohydrate and their insulin use goes down? What? That doesn't make any sense, right? So that's the type of changes that we see in people with type 1 diabetes or those injecting insulin with type 2. And then for those that don't inject insulin, what they notice is that they start to lose weight. Practically everyone starts to gain energy right off the bat. And 100% of our attendees get much more stable blood glucose values during the event while they're there.
And I'm guessing what you guys are doing also because of your history as health coaches as well is that you're spending time following up with them as well, making sure that they're kept on track even after the retreat. So it's not as if you guys are just spending a long weekend in the desert with a handful of people and then ultimately just letting them go off on their own. You're helping them after as well. So it sounds like such a great opportunity for anybody who is trying to really get their diabetes under control. Now, Robby, what I'm hoping that you'll be able to answer for me is it sounds like a great program. What are you guys really hoping to accomplish with mastering diabetes over the next year and say over the next couple of years? What's the ultimate goal, really?
I'll tell you what, Craig, we want every single person in the world to know that this is an option. We really we understand not everybody's going to do this, but we want to raise the awareness that this is a very good option for anybody living with diabetes, and then provide the tools and support for people that need that guidance to actually apply it in their lives. But the bottom line is just this concept of people walking around thinking, I have diabetes, I can't eat carbohydrates, I can't eat fruit. We're just not going to let that happen. This just got to stop.
So you guys are on a mission. That's awesome.
We're on a mission.
That's awesome. Well, you have to have a mission because otherwise there's no purpose. Then it's just a job, right? So the fact that you guys have such a solid mission behind what you're trying to accomplish makes it even more important that you accomplish your goals. So a couple more questions for you, and then I'll wrap up here with you. If you guys were to meet, say, someone who was recently diagnosed, and you probably do all the time, what are just 3 concepts to someone who is starting to manage their diabetes can integrate into their lifestyle today to live healthier, whether or not that's a plant-based diet? Let's actually remove that from the equation, actually. So what are three of the top things that you might recommend outside of plant-based whole foods diet that somebody can do to help manage their diabetes?
I'll let Cyrus take this one.
All right. I'm just thinking off the cuff here. If we're going to remove plant-based diets from this argument,
that would have been too easy if I gave you that one. So then you would have given me 2.
No, that's good, actually, because I think it goes well beyond that. Okay, number 1, first and foremost, your insulin requirements, whether the insulin is being produced by your own pancreas or whether you are injecting insulin using a syringe or an insulin pump from the outside world, the amount of insulin that your body needs to operate is dependent upon, first and foremost, the total amount of fat that is going into your mouth. And then secondly, it's dependent on the total amount of carbohydrate that goes into your mouth. So that would be concept number 1, that you can't eat fat for free because fat influences how much insulin you need. Number 2, movement and frequent movement is incredibly important and incredibly effective for long-term blood glucose control. And what a lot of people experience who have been living with diabetes over a period of time is that they lose energy. So they lose energy and then they become less active. And then a lot of people think, oh, well, this is just a side effect of living with diabetes. And what we know to be true and what we have experienced ourselves is that a loss of energy isn't necessarily a side effect of diabetes as much as it is a side effect of a diet that has a poor nutrient quality. So by changing your diet towards a very nutrient-dense diet, you can actually gain tremendous amounts of energy in a short period of time, which will then help you become more active, which will then help your blood glucose control. So that would be number 2. Robbie, help me out with number 3.
No, I think that was number 3, and I think you broke the rules.
You did. No. That's all good. We'll take number 3 as whole foods, plant-based diet as well.
Love it.
So
no, but honestly, no. If we're gonna add in a third one, that's honestly has nothing to do with food, particularly like any diet in general. Just a principle. A principle would be the accountability. Like you really need, if you don't want to join a coaching program or whatever, find a friend you're gonna do this with, but going on this journey of trying to make any positive change in your life all on your own is just usually not that successful. So, find people to go along whatever journey you want to go along with you and look for that support and accountability. It's a big deal.
Definitely. Support system is super important. So here's the last question I have for you guys. Robbie, I'll go to you first, and this is a slightly personal question. Not really personal, but what is the best piece of advice that anybody has ever given you, whether it's diabetes related or not diabetes related? Best single piece of advice.
Honestly, a single piece of advice, the thing that's had the biggest impact on my entire life, beyond just diet, is honestly, it's a book, and it's called Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. And this sort of philosophy and way of looking at life has just had I can't even put into words the impact. It's just the ability to have relationships with people, whether it's business, customers, friends, loved ones, whatever. It's that sort of way of thinking, looking at life, where you sort of see people's feelings and needs and don't really take things personally. And it's just really powerful. So that's what I would say.
That's great. I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. I have not heard of that one yet. Cyrus, how about you?
One of my really good friends turned to me one day and he said, Cyrus, stress is a choice. And my mind was blown. And I was like, what do you mean? He says, listen, if you are highly stressed or, experiencing a lot of stress for some period of time, most of the time it's because you've made a subconscious decision to feel that way, because it's a decision that you actually made without even knowing it. And the reason why I think it's such a powerful statement for me is because I have that in my head at all times. And I do believe that he's absolutely right. By choosing to reduce my stress levels and live a low stress life, I'm able to experience so much more out of life. And as a result of that, so many other opportunities become available to me. And so, by recognizing that my stress levels are actually a conscious decision, enables me to actually live a very rich and very thorough life. And it's something that's fundamentally transformed the way that I approach the world.
Yeah, there's no doubt. There's definitely power in the way that we view situations, because situations inherently are not stressful or otherwise. It's how our mind perceives those situations. And that really comes back full circle to this concept of our blood sugars and our diet as well. It's how we perceive what we're putting in our bodies, what our blood sugars are. Is it good or bad? We have the ability to, and I can just say, when I have a high blood sugar, the first thing I say is I get stressed out, and it's the only reason that it's a stressful situation is because I made it a stressful situation. Yeah. So that said, where can everybody find you guys online? You're all over the place, but is there a specific place you'd like to lead everybody?
Best place to go is masteringdiabetes.org. You go there, and in the upper right corner, there's a place where you can sign up, and you'll get this beautiful PDF that we've put together, which explains and details some of the stuff we talked about today. And that'll also get you signed up for our newsletter, and that's where we give all our updates of everything that's going on, whether we put out a new video on YouTube about research or a new recipe or we have another retreat. Best place to be is on the newsletter.
That's great. So what I'm going to do is in the show notes, I'll also put a link to the website. I'll put a link to all of your social media channels as well as YouTube, which you guys definitely have some awesome videos on YouTube as well. So Cyrus.
Sounds great. Yeah. I love people to interact on Instagram. This is a new concept. Come in and look at the pictures I'm putting there. Look at my Insta stories, see what I'm eating, see how much insulin I'm injecting, and interact. Ask questions. Write back to me. We're here to help and raise awareness for this approach.
Yeah, Cyrus, I think Robby definitely beats you for the best Instagram account on the call. His pictures.
There was never any question. I don't even compete with this guy. I can't compete on his level.
I'm not sure too many people who can, actually. The fruit is just beautiful. So awesome. So Cyrus and Robby, thank you guys so much for all of your awesome insights. As I said at the top of the show, I'd love to keep the conversation going, and it would be great to schedule a second round in the future if you guys are up for it. But for now, I just really want to say thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Not only do you have the greatest voice of all time, but I know without doubt that as you continue to crank out more and more content, specifically for the community of for people living with diabetes, we're here to support in whatever way we possibly can, because your ethos is perfectly aligned with our ethos. So thank you for all that you do, and however we can help you out as well, you just let us know.
I appreciate that greatly. The feeling is mutual. Thanks, guys. So if you guys are interested in learning more about Cyrus, Robby, and Mastering Diabetes, you will head over right now to thebravestlife.com/003. Check out all the details and links in the show notes. I want to thank you for joining us for this episode of the Bravest Podcast. If you like what we're doing here, please be sure to share this episode with someone you love. Again, the link is thebravestlife.com/003. I'm Craig, and we will catch you next time on the Bravest Podcast.